It's a sad fact of life that unless you're a cinematographer making waves in Hollywood, we don't get access to the perfect camera. We don't get to play around with $100,000 ARRI systems that the production companies rent anyway because they're too expensive to buy. It just doesn't work like that, and it goes without saying that on a drone this size, with a camera this size, or even this kind of Phantom series here, of course there are going to be limitations, even compared with this kind of semi-professional level Panasonic GH5. There have to be restrictions. So in a world where new drones are coming out every 5 minutes, it seems, with new performance, new sensors, new this, that, the next thing, let's step back a second and figure out how to make the most of the gear that we already have before we necessarily go out and replace it with the new latest and greatest. Hello, my name is Stewart and welcome to Drone Film Guide, the channel where we learn to fly like filmmakers and home to the world famous 8-hour drone cinematography masterclass. If you want to go from drone owner to drone pilot to drone cinematographer, then we recommend you check out our course. It's informative, it's immersive, it's cinematic, it's full of high production value, it's a beautiful piece of work, and you will benefit tremendously from it, pretty much irrespective of what level of experience you have. So if you want to find out more about that, there's a link in the description with a discount code embedded, so do check that out. Now, if you've followed this channel for a while or you've invested in the masterclass, you will know that we come at things very much from a "it's what you do with it that counts" perspective. There is always going to be a better drone out there. There's always going to be a better camera out there. It's quite a pain, and it's very easy for us as filmmakers to make excuses based on our equipment for why we're not getting the results that we think we should be getting. So we're going to talk about 3 steps to help you get the most out of the equipment that you already have. First up, we have to identify the camera's limitations. Of course, as we've said, there are limitations on these tiny cameras with typically quite small sensors. They don't have the ability to gather light like larger sensor Micro Four Third camera like this, or a full frame sensor on something like a Sony a7S or R or a Canon 5D. As a consequence, we get noise in the shadows, we get poorer low light performance. It makes it difficult for us to stretch those colours out in post because the dynamic range of the camera is contracted. So we need to kind of think about all of that and see what we can realistically expect to get from these cameras. Second up, once we've identified the limitations, we can then adjust our shooting patterns accordingly. So we have to consider whether that shot is worth taking. You know, is that camera feasibly going to achieve a fantastic sunset? Or if we backlight a subject, are we going to get a beautiful, nice kind of roll off between the shadows and the highlights? Or is it just all going to be a little bit kind of mushy and ugly? Third up, once we've identified the limitations and adjusted our shooting patterns, we can look at post-production to enhance the picture further and really get the best out of whatever system it is that we're using. We want to maximize the dynamic range and therefore picture quality that we can get out of one of these cameras. Now, dynamic range, the difference in variation in greys in between absolute white and solid black, the more of that, the better. It creates a nicer, smoother roll-off from shadows through to highlights. In addition to extracting the best dynamic range, we also want to produce images with the least noise possible. Now, noise, all the flickering and grain that you see on an image, it can look okay in old school footage, old kind of film cameras, but on digital format, it can look really, really quite ugly. It manifests itself mostly in the shadows and the midtones. That's where you see it. It's actually throughout the image, but you see it most in the shadows. And it's particularly a problem for video because with the frames moving, the noise moves. So you see it darting about all over the screen and can look really, really ugly and can be very much to the detriment of the image. So we did a few tests on these 3 cameras. The first test we did was by taking some raw photos. That's uncompressed image. There's no compression in terms of taking it to a JPEG. On the video side, you don't get any H.264 compression that takes it into an MOV or an MP4 video file. So it's a completely lossless image that gives us the best idea of the noise performance of these sensors. We took a series of 5 photos, each photo being underexposed by 1 stop compared with the first. So the first photo we had perfect exposure, 0 EV as it would be depicted on your screen. The next photo -1, the next photo -2, the next photo -3. So they were deliberately underexposed. And then in post-production, we used the software to pull those exposures back up to 0 to see at what level we could recover the image in the event that it was underexposed. In the case of the raw photos, both of these cameras performed pretty well. You could see that by the time we were about 3 stops under, there was really a huge amount of grain to the point at which it was kind of ruining the image. We then redid that test with video files, underexposing as we went, bringing those exposures back to 0 EV in post-production, and then seeing what kind of impact that had on the quality of the footage. This was where the wheels came off. It became quickly apparent that underexposing these images with an expectation that you can recover those shadows and midtones in post-production results in an awful lot of noise. So there we have our first real lesson with these two cameras. We cannot expect to underexpose even 1 or 2 stops and then pull that back in post-production and get the same result as if we just exposed correctly in the first place. Underexposing these shots with a view to then increasing exposure is extremely detrimental to the picture quality, introduces a ton of noise, and if you're looking for some high quality results, you cannot afford to do that. Interestingly, when you look at the Mavic Air versus the Phantom 4 side by side, the noise, in my opinion, on the Phantom 4 is much more pleasing. There's no noise reduction on either of these, so this is the clean image coming off the memory card, and the Phantom 4 seems to actually perform much better, which is interesting because the footage on this supposedly records at 100 megabits per second, and here we've got about 60 megabits per second. So it just goes to show that the stated specifications aren't always the full story. We found this to do a little bit better on the video side in a low light situation. When we compared the results of these two cameras with the result of this Panasonic GH5, of course the result here was much better thanks to the Micro Four Thirds sensor. It's not the biggest sensor in the world, but it's significantly bigger than the sensor that's on these two cameras, and it makes a huge difference, which is why with the Phantom 4 Pro or the Mavic 2 Pro, which has a 1-inch sensor, which is not as big as this, but getting there, we can expect much better performance than from these two drones. Anyway, for the sake of this discussion, we don't want to go out and buy a Phantom 4 Pro or a Mavic 2 Pro. We want to stick with this system and we want to make the most of what we've got. So, now we know that we can't underexpose images, we know that we can't stretch it out in post, particularly without destroying the image. So, what do? We need to change our shooting patterns and modify our shooting patterns to make sure we don't find ourselves in a situation where we have to recover detail in post, because we now know that's not going to be possible. Before you can modify your shooting patterns, having done your own tests on your own drones and arrived at your own conclusions, you need to be sure that you can create some nice drone cinematography in the first place. So if this is all kind of new to you and you don't really understand why one shot is good and why one shot is bad, and composition is a word that you've heard but doesn't really make any sense, then check out our drone cinematography masterclass. It's been out for a few months now. The feedback on it has been fantastic. It really is immersive, fast-paced and enjoyable and extremely educational, and we really will get you from drone owner to drone pilot to drone cinematographer. Check out the link in the description below with the discount embedded, and then we can get back on with thinking about how to really make the most of our shots with the equipment that we have at hand. So you understand light, you understand composition, and you're creating some nice shots with your drones. Well, then it's easy then. Just always shoot beautifully exposed, well-composed shots with nice balanced skies and landscapes, and we're sorted. There's no problem whatsoever. You'll get the most out of these drones. Now, of course, in certain situations, that's true. In other situations, it's not. What about a high contrast scene? I'll give you an example. A typical example of a high contrast scene would be a sunset or a sunrise. You've got a very bright sun in the sky and everything else is very dark. So you have to expose for that sun. Otherwise, you're going to end up with this horrible kind of mush of blown out sky and some kind of middle ground, unsatisfactory exposure on the ground itself. That's a high contrast scene. Another example of a high contrast scene that we find ourselves in quite a lot as wedding filmmakers is we'll be doing a drone shoot with a bride on a sunny day. She has a bright white dress, but then the rest of the landscape is quite dark. So if we're shooting for that bright white dress, we have to expose for the subject. We have to expose for that bright white dress. If not, it's going to be blown out, it's going to look horrible, it's going to look amateurish. As a consequence, especially if the sun is hitting that dress, we need to get some serious ND on there, an ND 64 or something like that, if we're going to stand close to getting a 1/50th of a second shutter at 25 frames per second. The rest of the image is underexposed, it's dark. We don't necessarily want that image to be dark, but we don't have a choice because we have to expose for the dress. Now, the technique that you would use if you're shooting with a higher quality camera like this, you would expose for the dress, deliberately underexposing the rest of the shot, because you know in post-production that you can recover some of those midtones, some of those shadows by just moving the sliders, and you're going to get a fairly nice balanced exposure with a well-exposed dress. But we've just established with these two drones that we can't do that without destroying the image, without bringing an unnecessary and unwelcome amount of noise into the image. So we have a problem. Can we modify the shooting patterns in that kit scenario? Not really, in all honesty. So in this case, that is why we, as professional filmmakers doing very high-end weddings, have upgraded, and we now use the Mavic 2 Pro for shots like that to get some kind of better dynamic range and better performance. But as I say, that is us as professional filmmakers. If you don't have that kind of pressure or expectation on your shoulders, you might not need to move to a different system. So you've figured out the limitations of your drone, you've thought about whether you can work around those limitations or whether that sunset shot that you wanted is just not going to happen because it's not realistic. Now let's look at post-production just to see if we can tweak the image that little bit more. Now we've already been playing around in post-production with exposure there, and we've figured out that it's, there's not a huge amount we can do if we're underexposed. But what about colour? This is particularly important when we're matching cameras. Did you notice in any of those test shots how red the shots coming off the Mavic Air were? It didn't take us long to realise, having taken this Mavic Air to a few weddings, that as soon as the light dimmed a little bit or the shot was slightly underexposed, everything went very red. This kind of red colour cast went over everything. And it really made it quite hard to balance these shots with the ground camera work that we were getting off the GH5s. Let me take you through a fairly rustic approach to analysing the colour of the camera on your drone and seeing if you want to be making any modifications in post-production. I set up this controlled shot here in the hall of our house. Now that's a grey wall there with some white panelling beneath it on the left hand side and a white door on the right hand side. Kind of looks okay in this picture. Because I've told you that the shots are a wee bit red, you can see some of that red coming through. So that's the Mavic Air. Let me show you the shot here from the GH5 for comparison. Completely different. Now just to clarify, these are both set to custom white balances of 5500K. It's a daylight balanced light that's coming down on that wall. Nothing changed. Everything is the same between these two cameras, and you can see the absolutely strikingly different results. Now imagine if you were trying to balance these two cameras in post-production. You're trying to mix these in an edit and you've got color differences like that going on. It can create a bit of an issue, so it's very illuminating for us to do these tests as well. So we need to try and correct this color cast by taking out some red. Now because we've identified, and because I've told you that red is the issue here, you could just go into your color controls and just take out some red, but we don't really know when is too much. We don't want to make the shot blue or not, so let's try and find some objective way of doing that. I'll bring up the waveforms and let me crop in on the section that I know to be grey. So what I'll do here, crop the bottom here, so we crop up here and then we crop to the right. And you see how the waveform's changing there? And what we're getting is the waveform is just depicting what it shows in that box. Now let me show you this. If I just make that a little bit bigger. Here you can clearly see in this sample that the red, green and blue are sitting at different levels. There's more red in this shot than there is green and blue. Now as I said, grey is made up of red, green and blue in equal measures. In this case, roughly here sitting at about 50 IRE on the RGB parade. Let's not get into that in too much detail just now. All you need to know is that they need to be roughly equal, because this is a pretty rough and ready test. You should really be doing this with a proper grey card which is perfectly balanced and absorbs light frequencies in the correct way and all that kind of stuff. We're just doing this rough and ready, but it gives you a rough idea of what to do. So let's bring up the colours again. And we're just going to go along to this colour slider and we're going to pull out some red out of this image. So we slide all the way across to the side here. Now, as I start to bring the red down, look at that RG parade even up, RGB parade. And there we go. Something like that, give or take. It's not perfect because that image that I'm showing you, that crop is actually a whole bunch of greys. As you can see there, it's a bit of a gradient going from dark grey to light grey. That's why those lines here are quite thick. If this was just a perfect block of grey, those lines would just be single thin lines. But nonetheless, that gives us a fairly rough and ready and rustic approach to taking red out on an objective basis. Look at the difference. I'm going to show you the before and after. Let's look at the before and after. Before, after. You're kidding me. That is how much of a difference it has made taking red out, and it just looks completely different. Let's see how that compares with the GH5. Much closer, much closer. We're going to get into that in a whole lot more detail at some other point with some of the other drones as well. This is a huge subject, especially when we start getting into 8-bit versus 10-bit, and thanks to the Mavic 2 Pro, we're going to have endless confusion about that kind of subject. H.264 versus H.265 codecs, oh my goodness, what is that all about? Anyway, come back to us and we'll talk you through it in the fullness of time. But there you've seen the third step of the process, checking post-production to see if there's any way that you can modify the colours a little bit just to really get the optimal result from that camera. So what has this whole exercise achieved? As I say, the whole point of the exercise was not to criticise any camera. The whole point of the exercise was to get the best out of it. We identified that the camera does have limitations, and as a consequence we now shoot better because we know what we have to achieve to get some great results from the camera. We can't underexpose, so we're even more focused than before on that histogram when we're recording. By the way, we have a video on the histogram. If you don't know how to use the histogram, check out the histogram so we can get some nice exposures, because we know that exposure corrections are not particularly good or beneficial when we do them in post. That's cool. We've also changed our colours a little bit. We've identified that there's a colour cast on this camera and that we need to take some red out in post-production to really get an optimal result. Even if you're not balancing it with another camera, red is going to make your skin tones look horrible. If there's people in your shots, it's just going to throw things off a bit. So you don't want any misrepresentation of colours. At the very least, you want to get back to a nice correct colour base so you can then put a grade on later, or a lookup table, a LUT, whatever you want, a preset in later stages, and that will give you the right starting point for doing that process. Different drones for different purposes for different people, but if you have a better understanding of how to analyze them, then you have a better understanding of how to use them. Okay, enough of that. Don't forget to check out the masterclass, link in the description below with the discount code embedded. We have an Instagram page where we put up photos and wee videos and all that kind of stuff, different kind of content. Stay tuned and we will see you again here on Drone Film Guide.